In the far north of Russia, there is a city where winter lasts 9 months. The sun disappears for weeks. Temperatures reach -50 degrees. The wind cuts like a knife. Abandoned buildings, entire neighborhoods with no one around, statues of forgotten heroes covered in eternal snow. A city that was once the pride of an empire, a symbol of power and resistance, and today is slowly dying. Every year, another building collapses. Every winter, more families flee. Every decade, thousands of people give up on calling this place home. But there are still those who remain. What keeps a city alive when everything seems to be conspiring against it? What is it like to grow up in a place where even the climate seems to say that humans shouldn't be there? And why would anyone choose to stay in a city that the rest of the world has forgotten? You'll find out all this and more right now. In today's Bello Mundo, we're heading to the far north of Russia to show you what life is like in the city considered by many to be the most depressed on the planet. A place that was born out of tragedy, grew through sacrifice, and now faces an uncertain future at the top of the world. Number 1. Location and general information. In the far north of Russia, there is a city where practically everything works against those who live there. Its name is VORKUTA. It is in the middle of nowhere, above the Arctic Circle, in a region known as Komi. If you've never heard of it, it's no surprise. It's the kind of place that seems to exist only on maps or in survival documentaries. VORKUTA is closer to the North Pole than to St. Petersburg. To give you an idea, it's more than 1,900 kilometers to Moscow, and only 180 to the Arctic Ocean. The name itself gives a clue as to what this place represents. VORKUTA, in the language of the native peoples, means many bears. And the truth is that before humans, only bears occupied this frozen piece of land. Frozen is an understatement. Here, winter lasts 9 months. The average annual temperature is -5 degrees. When winter arrives, and it arrives in earnest, the cold easily reaches -50 degrees, and it doesn't stop there. There is the polar night when the sun disappears from the sky for weeks. There is the polar wind, which doesn't blow. It simply passes through everything. And when what they call summer arrives, you can barely put your coats away. 3 months of respite, and that's pushing it, with temperatures that almost never rise above 15 degrees. To make matters worse, the entire city is built on permafrost, soil that never thaws. This means that anything you try to build here is fighting directly against nature, and nature never loses. Still, there are people who live here, who survive, who resist. And then comes the question that won't go away. How did a city come to be in this godforsaken place? And more, why? The answer is not poetic. Quite the contrary. It comes from one of the darkest chapters in 20th century Russian history. Number 2. Where it all began. VORKUTA was born out of suffering, and there's no way to sugarcoat it. In the mid-30s, while the Soviet Union was under the control of Joseph Stalin, the country witnessed the expansion of one of the most brutal systems in modern history, the forced labor camps known as the Gulag. These were veritable human-grinding machines strategically scattered across the most remote corners of Soviet territory. There, punishment and productivity went hand in hand. On the one hand, any form of opposition to the regime was eliminated. On the other, this disposable labor force was used to transform uninhabitable regions into centers of resource exploitation. And that is exactly how this place came to be on the map. In 1931, they discovered that the soil of VORKUTA hid one of the largest coal reserves in the country. For Moscow, it was black gold in the right place, fuel to feed Soviet industry. But who would have the courage to work here in these conditions? The answer was unanimous. No one. Or rather, no one who had a choice. In 1932, the first trains from the gulags began to arrive. They were full of prisoners, people accused of being enemies of the state, politicians, teachers, religious leaders, intellectuals, peasants who had resisted collectivization, and also common criminals, all mixed together in the same hell. They were thrown there in the middle of this white desert to do one thing: dig coal. With their hands, with pickaxes, with whatever they could find, 12, 14, even 16-hour days, eating poorly, dressed even worse, in the freezing cold. In the early years, there was no mention of a city. There were no houses, buildings, or any kind of infrastructure. The prisoners simply dug holes in the frozen ground to try to protect themselves from the wind and snowstorms, or improvised tents that barely withstood the first snowstorms. Hunger, cold, and forced labor were a near-certain death sentence, and those who did not succumb to the climate often died of exhaustion, illness, or simply buried alive in the makeshift mines. Even so, the coal had to keep coming out of there. So, year after year, more and more prisoners were sent there to replace those who did not survive. And so, little by little, the tents became lodgings. Then the first administrative buildings appeared, dormitories for the guards, structures for mine maintenance, and, eventually, houses for free workers, those who agreed to move there in exchange for high wages and benefits that would have been unthinkable anywhere else in the Soviet Union. That was how, in the middle of nowhere, Vorkuta ceased to be just a labor camp and became a real city, if you can call a place built under such conditions real. And everything there revolved around the mines. The very organization of the city reflects this to this day. It was designed in a ring shape, with several settlements scattered around each mine, as if they were small satellites. Each of these centers functioned as a mini-city, with an administrative area, a residential area, and, of course, direct access to the mine, which was the heart of everything. And the most curious, or perhaps saddest thing, is that, after decades of serving as an open-air prison, Vorkuta did indeed become a prosperous city, at least for a while. After Stalin's death in 1953, the camps began to be decommissioned. Forced labor gradually decreased until it was officially ended in 1962. But then comes the part that almost no one talks about. Many former prisoners stayed. Some because they had nowhere else to go. Others because, after decades there, that frozen place had somehow become what they called home. What was supposed to be just a place of suffering became a city, and ironically, it even had its years of prosperity. Number 3. The Golden Age. If in the 30s and 40s Vorkuta was synonymous with suffering, punishment, and survival, the following years told a completely different story. Starting in the 60s, after the official end of the labor camps, the city began to attract a different kind of people. Now, those who came here were no longer prisoners. They were ordinary workers, people who were willing to face isolation and cold in exchange for above-average wages, free housing, and a list of benefits that, by Soviet standards, seemed like something out of this world. Early retirement, longer vacations, and access to products that the rest of the country could only dream of. It didn't take long for that old prison camp to become a heavy industrial hub with big city life in the middle of nowhere. At its peak, Vorkuta had more than 200,000 people living there, scattered between the main city and the neighborhoods surrounding the mines. And it was no small feat. There were more than 10 mines operating at the same time, extracting high-quality coal that fueled much of Soviet industry and was still exported. But Vorkuta wasn't just mines, freight trains, and smoke on the horizon. The city became, in fact, a place to live. Theaters, cinemas, libraries, schools, hospitals, sports centers. Everything was up and running. Even the climate, in a way, was overcome. The entire city had central heating. Tunnels and covered walkways connected the buildings, so you could get around without having to face the wind cutting through your skin. There was even a greenhouse producing fresh vegetables all year round in the middle of the Arctic. Those born here grew up in a protected environment, studied, and had access to a good education. Many people got scholarships to study at universities in Moscow and Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg. And those who chose to work here knew exactly what they were doing. The math was simple. Work 15, 20 years, earn good money, save. Because, let's face it, there wasn't much to spend it on. And then move to a city with a decent climate in southern Russia, Ukraine, or anywhere else far from all that ice. For a long time, living there was a source of pride. The city became a symbol of how the Soviet regime was able to bend nature, transforming even the most inhospitable place into a productive center with life, infrastructure, and a future. But like any city that depends on a single thing, that future had an expiration date. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it wasn't just the country that broke. Vorkuta also began to sink, and fast. Number 4. The beginning of the end. When the regime fell, the money ran out, subsidies disappeared, the guaranteed market disappeared. What remained was economic chaos where those who could not adapt went bankrupt, and Vorkuta had nowhere to run. The mines began to close, first the smallest ones, then one after another. Each mine that shut down took the entire neighborhood with it. Businesses, schools, homes, everything. And the city began to shrink. Without work, without heating, which depended directly on the mines, and without any prospects, people began to flee. But getting out of here has never been that easy. People who had lived their whole lives in the Arctic had no savings and nowhere else to go. Those who tried to sell their apartments were in for a shock. Properties that had once been highly sought after were now worth practically nothing. With luck, you could buy a cramped little room in southern Russia, if you were lucky. The government even tried to help, creating a relocation program and offering a few bucks. But there wasn't enough money for everyone. All it did was alleviate the problem for some and push the rest forward. What we saw was a lot of people leaving everything behind. Furniture, photos, clothes, memories. They took what they could fit in a suitcase and left. But in the midst of all this, there were always those who stayed. And then the question arises, who in their right mind would choose to stay? The answer is not simple. For many people, Vorkuta is the only home they have. Others had no choice, especially the elderly, who had no money or family elsewhere. And there are also those who accept the cold, the isolation, and even like the pace of life here. The salary is still reasonable for those who work in the mines, and teachers, doctors, and engineers receive extra pay for agreeing to live in these conditions. Thus, year after year, the city emptied out. Entire buildings were abandoned, and sometimes in the middle of a 5-story block, there was a single window lit up. Someone who, out of stubbornness, attachment, or simply lack of options, still calls this place home. At the turn of the millennium, the decline turned into a free fall. The city, which in the 80s had more than 200,000 inhabitants, reached 2020 with less than 50,000. A drop of more than 60%. And it didn't stop there. And when it gives way, there's not much you can do. Buildings crack, foundations sink, and the whole structure simply collapses. That's it. A city that is literally sinking, and those who live here are sinking with it. Now that you understand how this happened, there's one question you can't ignore. What's it like to live in a place that is simply disappearing? Number 5. Daily life. For those who still live in Vorkuta, life is basically about surviving in the midst of what's left. There are about 50,000 people who remain here, dealing with isolation, the cold, and a city that loses a little more of itself every year. The day starts early, even when there is no day. In the polar night, it is dark all the time. Children go to school in the dark, walking through the snow, lit only by streetlights and the lanterns they carry in their hands. And don't think that stops because of the cold. Classes are only canceled when the temperature reaches close to -50, and even then only for the youngest children. Teenagers continue to go to school. In schools that are still open, the windows are sealed with duct tape since autumn to try to keep out the wind that blows in. And that only comes off in spring, when the sun starts to show its face again. Those looking for work don't have many options. For men, the only jobs left are in the mines that are still operating, even though they are dangerous and could close at any time. For many women, the only option is public service, schools, hospitals, city hall, and that's it. Young people want to leave. Those who finish school already have their minds set on leaving. The university, which was once a benchmark, now has few courses, few teachers, and almost no new students. And those who leave to study in another city rarely return. In the market, there are only basic items. Everything is expensive. Everything comes from far away, if it comes at all. Fruit, vegetables, meat. Little arrives, and it costs a lot. Luxury here is fresh food. Leisure no longer exists. The theater opens when it can. There hasn't been a movie theater in a long time, and nightclubs are out of the question. Libraries and a few cultural centers are still trying to hold on, but it's unclear for how long. The internet has become practically the only window many people have to the outside world. It's where young people connect, talk, and, above all, remember that there is another way of life other than the one here. Transportation options out of the city are limited. There is an airport, but flights are expensive and subject to frequent cancellations due to weather conditions. The railroad, the same one that brought the first prisoners here 9 decades ago, remains the most reliable connection to the rest of the country. Winter is particularly challenging. In addition to the extreme cold and constant darkness, there is forced isolation. Many residents spend weeks without leaving their homes, except to go to work or buy essential supplies. Mental health is a serious problem. The combination of darkness, cold, and loneliness takes a toll on mental health. Depression, anxiety, alcohol, drugs. It's become part of the routine. And often, it ends the way everyone already knows. Even so, those who stayed put make the best of it. There is a strange, almost automatic sense of community. And Miners' Day, which is still the main event in the city, becomes that rare moment when everyone gets together, does something, celebrates, and remembers that, despite everything, there is still life here, but with fewer and fewer people, because every year another family packs their bags and leaves. Number 6. The future. What does the future hold for Vorkuta? Opinions differ among authorities and experts. If you ask the Russian government, the answer is full of optimism. On paper, the city appears as a possible logistics base for operations in the Arctic. With the ice melting, new sea routes may open up, and Vorkuta, which is already connected by rail, could be useful in this scenario. There is also talk between the lines that the city has military value. It's no secret that the Arctic has become a disputed zone, and having a base here in the middle of nowhere could make a difference for those thinking about defending their territory. But in practice, those who look at it with a calculator in hand see something else. Economists say that keeping Vorkuta running costs billions every year, and if you think only about money, it would be cheaper to take everyone who still lives here. give them a house, a job, and a new life in another city, and simply close the doors here for good. Environmentalists aren't any kinder. They ask how long it makes sense to continue mining coal in the middle of a tundra that is already melting, while the whole world is trying to get rid of fossil fuels. Continuing to dig here not only seems expensive, but also out of date. The truth is that VORKUTA has become a bizarre experiment. A city that was born out of suffering, had a few years of glory, and now struggles to survive, even when everything around it screams that this is no place to live. For now, it's still there, smaller, broken, empty, but it's there, holding on, dragging itself along as best it can, a city that simply refuses to die, even when everything points to it. And now I ask you, can you understand why this city is considered the most depressed city in the world? Would you visit a place like this? Would you venture to the end of the world to see a city that is disappearing before our eyes? Leave your comment below, and don't forget to like if you enjoyed this trip to the far north. See you in the next Bello Mundo.